Recording. And let me once again welcome everybody to the event Eminent Domain 1 year after Kelo, Implications for Community Development. This event is sponsored by KnowledgePlex, the National City Network, and the Government Innovators Network. Before I turn things over to our moderator, I would like to administer our first poll for the day. So if you would, just please click on the option that is most appropriate for you. You can click directly on your screen. We're going to be administering polls throughout the event today, so when you see a poll displayed on the screen, you may select the appropriate answer at your leisure. I think everybody will be delighted to see that we have a fairly diverse audience today. So I'm going to conclude this poll. And my last order of business is to introduce our moderator. Stephen Goldsmith is formerly the mayor of Indianapolis. He is also currently the director of the Innovations in American Government program and the Daniel Paul Professor of Government here at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Mayor?
Thanks, Jim. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you fine.
Appreciate your introduction. Let me welcome everybody. And we thought today that we would begin with a few questions and short responses from the panelists, and then try to engage the audience for the remainder of the time in a more intense give and take and dialogue about this enormously controversial subject. So I saw referenced even this morning in the Wall Street Journal editorial about the wetlands case from yesterday. So I approach this with as a former mayor with interesting set of ambivalence, the ambivalences having been aggressive with their use of eminent domain. And every time I used eminent domain, I was sure I was right and the public was protected, but many who were condemned did not quite share my enthusiasm. So let's begin today with Professor Barron, perhaps. So did Kelo really change anything, and what direction do you think we're moving? What are the parameters, Professor? Well, it seems appropriate to start with a lawyer first.
Well, there are two different ways you could take that question. Whether it changed constitutional law, I don't think it did in any dramatic way. There had been very broad statements equating the federal Constitution's provision that you can only take private property for a public use with the requirement that that mean you can only take it for a public purpose. For at least 50 years, the court had been on record saying public use essentially means public purpose, and it's true that they had never applied that in a situation quite like Kelo. And the big difference between Kelo and the prior cases was not that the property was being taken from one private person and given to another private person. Instead, the big difference was that in other cases they had taken it from one private person and eventually given it to another, but the basis for the condemnation was that the property was blighted. And in Kelo, for the first time, the court had upheld a taking from one private person, giving it to another private person, when there was no claim that the property in question was blighted or even that the general redevelopment area was blighted. Instead, the argument was that it served a variety of other goals, of which one was economic development. So in that sense, it was a small step beyond prior precedent, but not a dramatic break. I think what did change is that even though the court has been on record saying that you could do things very much like what the city of New London did in Connecticut, it had not generated the kind of public controversy about the meaning of the Constitution as a nationwide issue that the Kelo decision did generate. And I think part of that may be because once you loose the stricture that the property be blighted, it does become possible to say, well, then almost anybody's property could potentially be taken for an upgrade. And since everyone's property, in theory, can be upgraded at least slightly, it gave some force to the dissenter's argument that now everyone's property was at risk. I don't think that's actually an accurate account of it, but as far as that's, I think, where we lie now at the end of the Kelo decision, which is constitutional law really hasn't changed that much, but the public concern about it, I think, has changed a great deal.
As you, we can tell how persuasive you are because as you talk, people are changing their votes. So just before we move on, what are the limits then? Let's assume that the majority of the audience believes in kind of prudent use of eminent domain. If you don't have to show blight, then what are there any limits to the public taking?
Well, so there's a variety of different ways to answer that, and I think the first limit is that you have to get the government to agree to do it. And I think it's important not to just blow past that as if that's not a limitation at all. In a democratic society, before you can get any kind of governmental action done, you have to get public agreement for it, and that's some check, and I think the court believed that was an important check. The second check is that you can't just take the property, you've got to compensate them for it, and governments don't have unlimited funds to spend, and so the requirement that you actually pay just compensation is a check as well. As far as substantive limitations, what the court says in Kelo is, I think, two things, and maybe three. The first is that it does have to be for a public use rather than a private use. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if it seems that the predominant purpose of the taking is purely for the gain of another identifiable private individual, and there's no even hint or suggestion that what we're really trying to do is serve some public end through a public-private partnership, then the court, I think, is suggesting that's unconstitutional. Of course, the problem is, how do you ever know, and isn't it always possible to characterize something as being potentially for the public good? Mayors aren't in the habit of saying, we're going to do this major action. I just want to tell you it's not going to benefit anyone in the public at all. It's only going to serve one private individual's benefit. They don't say that. The second limit that the court talked about is it has to be part of a comprehensive planning effort. And the people who are against the Kelo decision, I think, tend to think that's an equally phony restriction. I'm not of that view. I think actually the constraint that you have to engage in a serious overall comprehensive planning effort is in fact a check and is actually not going to be always something that can be achieved. And that leads me to the third restriction that the court identifies, which is evident in the opinion itself, and that's that when it's a one-to-one transfer outside the context of a comprehensive planning effort, the court does suggest they're going to look at that quite skeptically. And there's a footnote in the majority's opinion to a case called, I think it's 99-cent store versus Costco, in which a town had basically just taken a 99-cent store and given it to Costco because Costco was bigger and they thought it would be better for the tax base. A federal district court said that goes too far. That's not part of any planning effort. That's not anything other than a desire to just benefit a larger, more valuable piece of property, that you know what the property is, on the thought that that will be good for the tax base overall. And that's actually not going to qualify as a public use. And the court suggests that the 99-cent store case is right. They cite approvingly to it, or at least what I take to be approvingly to it, in the footnote. And I think that remains then an important constraint that's evident in Kelo. But overall, and I think it's fair to say, the court's general position is that the main check on the prudent use of eminent domain is what often is the main check on the prudent use of all governmental power, including taxation, which is that democratic officials responsive to a democratic electorate act in accord with the people's wishes.
So, thanks very much. Larry, let's kind of move on to you. And I was encouraged by Professor Barron, who said, let's just leave it up to the discretion of the mayor, who at all times represents the public good. But some of your NCSL legislators are across the country imposing restrictions on people like me. Talk to us a little bit about what the trend is there and what positions you all are taking.
Thank you. First of all, NCSL, National Conference of State Legislatures, is an organization not taking a position on any of the bills that have been introduced since the Kelo decision came down. We note that in the decision, the last paragraph talks about legislatures and state courts to determine what public use is for purposes of eminent domain, and that in fact several states have constitutional or statutory provisions on the books to address this issue of what is public use. So we welcome the idea that the court felt that state legislatures were a valuable institution to make these determinations, but we have no position on the substance of any particular bill. I have testified on legislation in states as diverse as Vermont and Maryland and Pennsylvania, as well as Tennessee and Georgia. So different approaches. We don't go into that testimony with an opinion as to the best approach. We just raise policy options. We have seen a significant response to the Kelo decision. And if you look at slide 3 that is up there, statutes, constitutional amendments, state legislatures.
Hey, Larry?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's me or you, but you fade away. I don't know if the rest of the listeners are having trouble as well or not.
Yeah, we were having trouble too.
Put the phone closer to the computer, then I won't have to go back and forth. See if this is better?
Much.
Okay. You'll see 31 states listed on that map having taken some legislative action in the last 12 months. And it's quite a diverse set of states, with the exception of the West Coast and some areas of the East Coast. It's been a very prevalent issue before state legislatures. During the 2005 sessions, after Kelo came down, we saw that 5 of the 13 legislatures that were still in session passed some type of law. And it's careful to note, it's important to note that there were only 13 states in session after Kelo came down. Unlike the Congress, state legislatures don't meet all year, and by June 23rd of last year, 3/4 of them had already adjourned for the year, so that the forum for passing legislation was much more limited. But since January of this year, of the 44 states that have come into session this year, all but 1 have considered some type of restriction on the use of eminent domain for economic development purposes. And when you combine the numbers for the 2 years, we've got 31 states out of a total of 46 that have been in session over the 2-year period passing some form of legislation. So that equates to about 2/3 on the nose. The types of bills are very different, and I don't know if you want me to go into the categories of the legislation right now, which will appear in my slides, or whether I should respond to that in questions. But most of the action has been statutory change. We've seen 6 states so far propose constitutional changes.
Yeah, let's look at those slides you have just for a second that categorize the types of changes, because there may be folks participating who, especially since I guess we'll probably leave the slides up, may want to look at kind of best practices or examples from some of these states by category.
Okay. The categories begin with slide 4. There are 3 slides that have categories. The 2 most prevalent approaches that we've seen both this year and last year are the prohibitions, where the legislation will very simply say you cannot use eminent domain for an economic development purpose. It may or may not define what economic development is. You cannot use it to enhance tax revenue, or you cannot use it to transfer private property to a particular private entity.
Hey, let me just interrupt you quickly, just to ask you a question about David's presentation. In these bullet points you have up here, does that assume no blight? That is to say, if there is blight, then these prohibitions would not kick in. It seems to me to make a big difference with respect to the presentation, whether they're prohibiting economic development, eminent domain, in the absence of blight, or whether that applies even when there is blight.
These apply in situations where the property is not blighted.
Not blighted.
It will have a blight exception, in other words.
Good. Okay.
And what they will do, though, and it will be on one of the other slides, is that they will redefine what blight is. But just as a general rule, the statutes that prohibitions on the use of eminent domain, and this is the most predominant approach that we've seen. 21
Mr. Morandi, we're having a little trouble hearing you again.
I'm right staring at the phone.
Well, I can hear you good now. Hopefully that was just temporary.
Properties.
Hey, Larry, I wonder if we moved on to David for a second. You could take a look at that phone, and we'll come back to you if that's okay. We're just missing large chunks of your presentation.
I can do about the phone. It's right in front of me, and it's all wired up for. It's been used often in this case.
Perhaps the handset, just picking up the handset.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll talk into the handset then.
Okay, go ahead.
Great. Thank you.
You want me to continue then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
the second category that we've seen doesn't take the prohibition approach, but it's an enabling approach, and it says that you can use eminent domain only for a public use or a public purpose or a public improvement, and it defines what public use is. Very few of the statutes prior to the Kelo decision had anything more than a narrow laundry list of what constituted public use. It might say for roadways, reservoirs, public buildings, but nothing in an overall context. These new statutes that we've seen this year, and we've seen 7 of the 31 states, have some component of defining what public use is, and typically it means the physical occupation, possession, and enjoyment of the property by the public at large, by a public utility, or by a public agency. So these are the 2 most active categories of legislation that we've seen. The next slide briefly outlines 2 others, and this is where we get into the blighted properties. These statutes, even the most restrictive, will have a blight exception. And there was criticism last year in 2005 sessions that some of these blight exceptions were huge loopholes, because the definition of blight in most state statutes prior to Kelo included properties that were an economic liability to the community. And that's a pretty large loophole. If you think that blight generally means, vermin-infested, tax-delinquent crack houses, and all of a sudden blight also means, oh, by the way, it's an economic drag on the community, that gives local governments a great deal of flexibility. What we've seen this year is including the blight exceptions, but tightening up the definition of what is blight. And typically that tightening will include statutory language to the effect that the property must be a public health, welfare, and safety threat, or it must be a nuisance, or it must be tax delinquent or vacant or not fit for human habitation. We don't see that in all of the statutes, but we see more of a trend toward tightening up what blight is. The next bullet is sort of the process approaches that we've seen, where there's been no substantive change in policy, but more of a transparency, that if you're going to condemn property, you don't give a homeowner a notice in the mail. You give a lot of public notice. You hold public meetings. You negotiate in good faith with the landowner over compensation. You require approval by an elected city council, things of that nature. And that's what we have categorized as sort of the process category.
Let me ask, while we're on that point, let's just go to David for a minute and let him react, and in particular on this issue. So,
David Barron or David Parkhurst?
Let David Parkhurst first, because I want to think a little bit about the issue that was just raised. So, Clearly, there has to be a legislative. Maybe both of you actually. But let's start with the city view. Clearly, there has to be a legislative regimen. So why don't we have a situation where maximum discretion is allowed to the local legislative body rather than either the Congress or the state legislative body severely and prescriptively setting up either the process or the substantive rules for eminent domain? So how about the NLC response to the National Council of State Legislators?
Well, I'll start, Mr. Mayor, with a answer to that. That as organizations really formed by the states, we follow state law. Eminent domain is a state-derived power, obviously is best at the state level. That really actually encapsulates the reason that the National League of Cities got involved in the Kelo case to begin with. This is a great test case on federalism. And it was a great case, as Justice Stevens made clear in his opinion, where the Supreme Court in saying that, hey, eminent domain is state-derived power, and the states are not being prohibited from enacting stricter legislation governing eminent domain. Now, how municipalities reacted to the decision in the past year? Well, I'd argue that municipalities have reacted by continuing to abide by eminent domain laws of their state. Oh, the decision sparked such a...
David?
Yes, sir.
You have to pick up your handset too, I think.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. The decision was based less on, the fury seemed less based on fact and more on the fiction that mayors were about to wave the green flag to start private developers with their bulldozers to pull down Grandma's house, when in fact, that, as Professor Barron summarized so succinctly, wasn't the case. Now, obviously, here in Washington, the public furor ignited the requisite outrage from Congress and promises to save Grandma's house through restrictive legislation. And NLC, unlike NCSL, we have engaged with both the House and the Senate on the legislative initiatives, and again, we can probably get into that as questions go forward. But again, I found it interesting looking back over the past year that while in some cases this public furor over the Kelo decision ignited some self-imposed limitations at the municipal government level, and one in particular, there's a county down in Southern Virginia, Patrick County, where the county commissioners adopted a binding resolution in July, just shortly a month after the decision came out, that prohibited the county and any of its related subsidiary governing bodies from using eminent domain to take private property for a public purpose, but still, as Larry had indicated earlier, permitting it for a public use. But the definition applied of public use was very narrow. Now, alternatively, you've got communities such as Red Bank, New Jersey, where the mayor and council actually stood up for the use of eminent domain, and they rejected public cries to request the prohibition on eminent domain completely. And I found this interesting. The mayor of Lakewood, Colorado, Steve Burkholder, a Republican mayor in a Republican state, made it clear in a letter to the Colorado congressional delegation, his position, I think really summarizes the issue from a municipal standpoint, that cities never stay the same. They either become a better place to live or they begin to decay. And for municipal officials, I think that summarizes the that daily tension that I know, Mayor Goldsmith, you felt in Indianapolis, balancing out between protecting individual rights versus ensuring the public good, and that's a difficult balance for local elected officials. Briefly, I just wanted to touch on the overarching position from our membership. that affirms really that, economic development projects, they're generally multi-phased and multi-year efforts. And we conducted a survey several months ago, and 76% of the municipal respondents indicated they had not used eminent domain in the past 3 years in connection with any economic development projects. However, 87% reported that their city had not, or alternatively would not, delay pending economic development projects because of the outcry over the Kelo decision. And Jim, if you get the chance, and I'll see if I can do it from here, I think it's my second slide summarizes just a brief summary of some similar survey results of state municipal leagues across the country just on that point.
Mr. Parkhurst, everything all right?
I'm fine. I'm all set. Back to the moderator.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to comment on the slide. I'm sorry. Thanks. All right. Well, let's do one more presentation, a quick response, and then go to the audience for questions. You can start asking your questions at any time. Brad, you're nationally known as running an exceptionally effective community development corporation. So, tell us a little bit about how you go about requesting or demanding that the city participate with eminent domain in order to facilitate your efforts, and what do you see any restrictions post Kelo that are affecting what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. And let me mostly tell sort of a story from the Bronx. But I'll start by saying that I think the reaction by community development groups, generally not-for-profit, community-based organizations that do affordable housing and economic development in neighborhoods, was to Kelo is shaped by a complicated and frankly somewhat ambivalent relationship of community developers to eminent domain and urban renewal. By definition, community developers believe that some private development serves a clear public purpose. And around the country, community developers have not only brought hundreds of abandoned neighborhoods back to life, but created hundreds of thousands of units of affordable housing, good jobs, retail spaces, and community centers. In New York City, a substantial amount of this was done with property that the city took through tax foreclosure when landlords abandoned it. And in a lot of cases, some meaningful amount of eminent domain was involved. And I think community developers in New York City, therefore, believe that it's a tool that's important to not just bring neighborhoods back, but to create some of the kinds of things neighborhoods need. But also, almost by definition, if there's community development, that makes clear that not all private development is community development, that not all of it serves a meaningful public purpose. Too often it displaces people and the benefits aren't meaningfully shared. And many of us have been in neighborhoods where we've seen urban renewal plans that did far more harm than good to the people and communities that we represent. And so I think community development professionals approach the problem in this sort of ambivalent space. And I'll tell one story from Melrose Commons in the Bronx that really reveals this. It's an area this is Elton Avenue in the Bronx in the 1970s. Substantial abandonment of this 35-block area in the South Bronx in the 1970s and 1980s. Anyone would have called substantial parts of this area blighted. And yet, when the city first proposed an urban renewal plan in 1989 and 1990, there was very little community participation in the neighborhood, and the 6,000 people who lived there, mostly African American and Latino, really felt like they were treated as though they didn't exist. They weren't involved in the planning, and they feared substantial displacement, the bulldozing of the existing housing stock, and concerns about future affordability and whether it would really be a mixed-income place. But community organizing stopped those plans, in large part because the city's eminent domain process requires the vote of the city council. And so folks were able to organize in the neighborhood and prevent the city council from moving forward with this urban renewal plan. And what was especially good about what happened was a community development group got formed called Nos Quedamos, emerging out of the oppositional organizing, but very quickly moving into community planning and community development. And over the next several years, the city and Nos Quedamos and a range of agencies, including the Pratt Center where I worked together on really a dramatic and inclusive plan, and ultimately mixed-use, mixed-income plan was adopted that relied meaningfully on eminent domain. Now, the city had already acquired almost about 70% of the land in this area that was involved in the broader urban renewal plan through tax foreclosure, but another 30% required eminent domain. And later on, by the mid-90s, when there had been this planning process, community residents and elected officials in the city council were ready to invoke eminent domain in a significant way in this area. And again, there were 99 parcels and a substantial number of private owners affected. For something that you can see, this is sort of just a slide that looks at sort of the different kinds of uses, and so it was sort of a mixed density and mixed income plan, transforming the area. And it was not only this kind of infill housing. You can sort of see in the back that there was actually a fair amount of preservation as well, and substantial changes. And what I think it suggests to me is that it's not a simple question of, not that blight's a simple question, but it's not a simple matter of sort of where and is the area blighted. But this broader set of questions that I think we've been hearing about, is there a meaningful...
Hey, Brad?
Mm-hmm.
Let me just interrupt you here for a second. We got a few questions. I'd like to go back to the blight question and ask all the speakers, including our constitutional scholar, to have several questions on, let me paraphrase them, kind of blight is in the eye of the beholder. Who gets to define blight, and what are the... Are there definitions of blight, and what are the process tools? So why don't you comment on what are the elements of blight that you saw in Melrose Commons, but I'd kind of like to have the other panelists talk just for a second about this blight issue, because obviously the broader the definition and the more discretion there is with respect to determination of blight, the less significant everything else is. So why don't you do that, and I'm going to ask maybe David Barron to talk about this blight definition, and then we'll go through the rest of the panels, and then we'll come back. I do want you to finish your presentation, but I want to talk about this issue for a second.
Sure. Can I use a slide here?
Slides are good. We're all watching.
All right.
We're all watching. We're voting.
All right.
But
I'm not actually going to use Melrose Commons. I'm going to go to Brooklyn Atlantic Yards, which is the big Forest City Radnor development that I can come back and talk to you about in more detail. But on the top here is the rail yards. And you can start to see sort of behind it some amount of things that almost anyone would consider blighted, like the building on the far lower right. And then on the far lower left, a building that is derelict, but you could imagine reusing. And then in the middle, two condo buildings, in each of which condos have sold for more than $1 million. And all four of them are proposed for taking with a blight finding in the Atlantic Yards development process. And I think it just reveals that I don't see how you could narrowly use blight. In Melrose Commons, you certainly could have said, look, this broad area is blighted. But as you went through property by property, it became quickly a much, much more complicated set of questions, which is why I think you need something besides, I can't imagine a very objective standard that would work to simply say it is or is not blighted, and that is, either allows or simply disallows eminent domain without this broader set of questions about process and broader public purpose determined by some political entity.
Professor Barron, if we, and Brad will come back, but let me just stick with this. Professor Barron, let's take this slide. No, let's go back to that slide, Jim. I think that's a really important slide. If we see from the National and Council of State Legislatures more than 20 states prohibiting economic development in non-blight situations, and this blight definition obviously is a threshold question, I think this picture at the bottom kind of represents my life in Indianapolis, which is there's going to be one of these two buildings sitting in the middle of a major economic development area that is generally populated by the building on the right. That is to say, there is substantial blight. But for those buildings in the center, I'm overriding the market, right? I'm using eminent domain to force a deal for those buildings which are not blighted. Talk to us a little bit about constitutional and procedural protections for those property owners in the center, or do they have none once we decide the area is blighted?
Well, as a constitutional matter after Kelo, we really don't have to worry too much about, just as a constitutional matter, whether we deem something blighted. And if there's a real significance to what Kelo said, it's that let's not have a big fight constitutionally over what's a blighted property or not. As a statutory matter, it will matter because, as Larry said, the states already had statutes that restricted it to blighted, had a blight requirement, and I'll come back in a second to what that meant, and they've been tightening it up, and I think Larry's accurate in saying that they are tightening it up. The critical point as a threshold matter, before we even get into what the definition of blight is whether the actual property you take has to be blighted, or whether the statute instead simply says that it has to be a blighted area. And that's an enormously significant legal distinction, those two things. And you can illustrate it easily if you look at the array of pictures that Frad's put up here. If the statute simply requires that the area be blighted, my guess is an area defined in the way the statute requires, whatever the geographic location has to be, how big, etc., that had buildings of this range probably will qualify as a blighted area. And that means if all you had to show is that the area is blighted, that even if an individual property within it was not, in other words, was million-dollar condos, the statute would be no prohibition at all against the taking going forward. By contrast, if the statute's written so that each individual property that's taken has to be blighted, then it doesn't matter if the area as a whole that's targeted for redevelopment has many blighted properties. Each individual parcel that's taken itself has to meet the definition of blight. And my guess is under none of the definitions that Larry's talking about, and I think this is right, would the million-dollar apartment building qualify. So what's actually happened, and this I think Larry can correct me if I'm wrong, but my review of the legislation so far is the majority of the statutes, even as they're tightening up on the definition of blight, are only requiring that there be blighted properties in an area, so that some properties that are taken need not be blighted at all, so long as they're located within an area that has blighted properties. And that's incredibly significant on the real-world practical decision-making level, because it means cities can continue to do quite substantial economic development projects in areas that are in decline, and they don't have to worry that if there's a particular property in the midst of that redevelopment plan that doesn't qualify as blighted, they can't take it.
Right. Yeah, this is Larry. That's a very good distinction that you make, because prior to the Kelo decision and legislatures tightening up these blight statutes, very few, if any, of the blight statutes addressed anything more than blighted areas. And the definition of a blighted area talked about a substantial number of blighted properties, or predominantly high number of blighted properties, whatever. The new legislation, very few of them have case-by-case language, but some of them do. Some of them require that blight be determined on a property-by-property basis. Some of them still talk about blighted areas. The Iowa legislation is very interesting, and it was vetoed by the governor because the governor felt it went too far in taking away a redevelopment tool from local governments. It initially says in the statute that you have to go make a property-by-property determination as to whether the area is blighted. If you, as a local government, make your decision based upon public input and a deliberative policy-making manner, then only 75% of the parcels have to meet the blight definition. And then you look at the blight definition, and the blight definition talks about a substantial number or a predominant amount of vermin-infested property. So you can see that the tortured process that legislators are going through. They really are trying to balance restrictions on the use of eminent domain, where you take someone's private property and turn it over to a big box store with no redevelopment plan, as was cited earlier, versus taking properties, some of which will not be blighted, but they're within a designated redevelopment area for a public use or a public purpose where there will be incidental private benefit. And that's a key distinction, that was very well made, and to me it really illustrates the tortuous process that legislators are going through in trying to balance all this stuff.
But the greater the economic benefit to the city, I would think, more likely the greater the private benefit to the employer, right? The more land you aggregate, the bigger the factory you build, the more you subsidize the office building, the more jobs you get, the more the public benefit, but more private benefit as well, right?
Right, but once again, as one of my slides, the last slide I have illustrates, legislators are looking at motives. It'll be slide number 8. It's called the L-wife out factor. They're looking at what is the motive of this condemnation. Is it primarily to benefit private entities or primarily to benefit the public? And oh, by the way, a private developer reaps a huge increase in business. Is it solely to promote economic development, or once again, is that just an incidental corollary benefit. And what's going to happen with all this legislation is this legislation is not going to solve a whole lot. It's going to make it very clear. Maybe clear is not the right word. It's going to provide some legislative intent to local governments. And David Parkhurst, you may want to comment on this. It's going to say to local governments, you get the gist of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make sure you don't transfer property to another private entity to benefit that private entity primarily or solely. But on the other hand, we know we need to give you some flexibility. And so by having language that you see in the statutes with these adverbs attached to it, you're still going to have things going to court to determine what was the primary use, the primary purpose, the primary benefit. It's only when you have language like solely, you can't condemn private property solely to benefit a private entity, that you have more clarity. And it's interesting, in New Mexico, the governor vetoed that state's legislation because he felt it was very vague. Prior to the veto, there was an amendment to the legislation that says you can't use eminent domain solely for economic development. Well, that would have given local governments a great deal of flexibility. They could have argued that, yeah, there'll be some economic development here, but the residents of the community as a whole will benefit. Once that language was struck and it went to the governor without the solely in it, he vetoed it.
I want to go back to Brad in a second, but let me ask a question from the floor first to any of the panelists. Is blight the only term out there? Is there a better term than blight in city or state law? I mean, are we all stuck with that word and must have many different definitions? Anybody used a different or better word?
Steve, this is David. I think that the term blight really is the key one that cities are going to use because, again, and I've seen this in negotiations here in Congress, trying to look at this from a federal level. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it's still a duck. And I think with blight, no matter what you call it, comprehensive redevelopment, attempt to urban renewal, metropolitan reinvigoration, I mean, it still gets back to the fundamental issue. And I think Larry, I think gets at the nub of this issue, which is, in my view, from the local perspective, what is it that bothers people the most? And what bothers people the most about the Kelo decision is the anxiety that the government could serve as the provider of taking my house to give it to you, Steve, for your personal private benefit. That gets us back to the issue that we just discussed, which is how do we approach this? And I think approaching it from an analysis of who is the primary versus the incidental beneficiary of that eminent domain for economic development project. And I think some of the thoughtful legislation that I've seen around the country deals with that more of an objective distinction between primary and incidental versus trying to put some type of an arbitrary percentage, as Larry mentioned in Iowa. Again, 75-25. Who's to say that 80-20 isn't a more appropriate split? And I think, David, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this takes us back to the legal discussion back in beginning in '54 with the Berman case.
Yeah, I think that's where the blight idea sort of first came into being. I guess my take on it is slightly different, which is that I think that the fear is less an anxiety about my property being taken from one private person to another private person than an anxiety about my private property being taken, regardless of who's going to get it. And I think what's been a constraint on that public anxiety for a long time is when the government takes it for public use to build a road or something like that, there's just not that many times it's going to happen, and you sort of know when you buy your house or what neighborhood you're going to live in, what the realistic chance is that a road's going to come flying through your neighborhood. I think what some of the anxiety that's been stirred up by Kelo is that another constraint that a lot of people felt they were protected from was, look, they're not going to take your property unless you're in a blighted neighborhood. So I can avoid being in a blighted neighborhood. Well, Kelo suggested even if you're not in a blighted neighborhood, if you're in a town that has a tax base that's declining, they can take your property because they want a higher tax base. That put a whole lot of people's houses into play in the consciousness of a lot of people that they thought were not in play. Because throughout the 50s, I mean, it was about 1 million African-American families, they think, were displaced during the 50s pursuant to the blight exception. that stirred up really no major public debate over the use of eminent domain akin to what's now been stirred up. So I think that the blight serves a political function. And one of the reasons that it's going to remain attractive to legislators and the like is that for a set of constituents who have a lot of access to the political process, assuaging them by saying that don't worry, this is still limited to the bad neighborhoods, is going to have a lot of political appeal, even though if they took it too far and suggested that we're only going to take actual blighted properties, the use of eminent domain as an effective redevelopment tool would be severely curtailed, and so they're actually not likely to pass a lot of legislation that's that strict. But I think the reason that you'll see blight being invoked and why it's attractive has as much to do with politics as it does with best practices for redevelopment.
So Brad, let's take that back to you. So we've got this kind of ringing endorsement that the city should use its governmental power to help you override recalcitrant landowners, even if they have nice buildings in blighted areas. So why don't you take us through the next chapter of Melrose and explain why it was worth it?
Yeah, sure, and I think I would agree with this. Assemblyman Richard Brodsky here has a funny statement. He says, blight is Yiddish for poor. And I think what a lot of folks in low-income neighborhoods have long feared is that the sort of reliance on blight was enabling the use of urban renewal in a set of ways that really had very disparate racial impacts. And that's why I sort of put this kind of equitable development framework out there. This seems to me the set of things, in addition to, I guess you might have included on this list, broader neighborhood transformation, making it a place that's safe instead of a place that's unsafe, a neighborhood of choice where people want to live. But it seems to me the debate you want to be having in a political body is, are the benefits proposed from this project broadly for the public? And I don't know that you can make a simple kind of who's it primarily for and who's it secondarily for, but do we collectively think that they are great enough to exercise this heavy power, right? I mean, no one takes this power lightly, especially when it's people's homes. And yet, if you believe that there are times when the broader public interest measured, again, and I agree, you probably can't come up with a real neat chart, what percent of blight and what percent of affordable units and how good do the jobs have to be and how much open space and how accessible. And yet this broad framework that's been put out there by organizations like PolicyLink and Good Jobs First and a range of national and local groups that says, let's think broadly, not just about what the benefits of this project are, but about how those benefits and burdens are shared. And what ultimately happened in Melrose was a persuasive case was made. At the end of the day, there was really very broad consensus amongst a wide range of interests that not only was blight being removed on Elton Avenue and in Melrose Commons, but that this kind of mixed-income, mixed-use neighborhood, 2,000 units of mixed-income housing, a community center, a whole lot of open space, infill as well as new construction, met the standards, and in the city council voted to pass it. The challenge in the Atlantic Yards case, which if people want I can go through in a little more detail, in my mind is less about is it or isn't it blighted than about the fact that this broad question, are the benefits worth the costs, is being answered by a much less democratic body, essentially an appointed board with a couple of people in Albany that the people in the neighborhood didn't vote for, as opposed to in Melrose Commons where it was the city council who made that determination. Does this development, do the benefits add up and make it worth this heavy process?
Well, if I could just underscore that just for a minute, because I think it's extremely important what Brad's saying. The way that the political discussion has gone forward to some extent, and the Institute for Justice has been pushing this in their campaign to overturn the Kelo decision, that what Larry called the substantive restrictions are the real restrictions. And what Larry called the procedural restrictions about the process by which we determine eminent domain are kind of cop-outs or phony. And I think what Brad's suggesting, and I share this view, and I think very important, which is that to some extent, actually who's deciding how to use eminent domain may actually be more important in the way it affects the actual lives of people than the substance of whether it's blighted or not blighted. If it's an appointed, unaccountable, private redevelopment agency acting as a public corporation, the odds that it will not be serving any kind of equitable development or any kind of community interest go way up. If it's being exercised by an organization that has real roots in the community, really effective engagement with them, the odds that it will serve their interests go way up. And just to underscore the point, there's another example of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston, in which it was a private community development corporation, totally private actors, not the government at all, They lobbied to be delegated the power of eminent domain themselves from the city of Boston because they thought we can do it right. The city eventually did delegate them that power, and by all accounts, they did do it right. That's pure private use of eminent domain. But it was a process in place in which the community was engaged, and I think you got a good outcome from it. So I think the process approach is actually quite a legitimate and important one and shouldn't be sort of put secondarily as, well, that's just a way of copping out and not really responding to Kelo.
Larry,
go ahead, Larry.
I just want to follow that up. That's a very important point, but I want to get clarification from Brad and David Parkhurst about the difference between community development agencies as creations of a local government and the locally elected council. And my question is, what is the difference? And what I mean by that, if you look at Connecticut statute, which led to Kelo, in Chapter 132, it gives the New London Development Corporation or corporations like it, under a broad state law that passed with huge margins, a long time ago, the authority to use eminent domain, provided a lot of this process stuff is followed. And one of the process things is that the locally elected city council approve of the eminent domain that's being used. And my question to Brad and David is this: is it too hard for a locally elected city council to overrule the use of eminent domain initiated by a redevelopment agency that has been given that authority? Or are they one and the same?
Well, I mean, the Melrose Commons case is exactly that and suggests that they're not one and the same. It was the city's housing department exercising urban renewal powers that moved forward the original plan. But, that's largely a redevelopment agency appointed by the mayor and doesn't include sort of local representatives as the city council does. And so it was the possibility that the city council would reject that plan that took them back to the drawing board to come up with a plan that would pass the city council. So I think in that instance at least, and in some others, there really is a meaningful distinction. And again, in the alternative case, the Atlantic Yards case or the West Side Stadium in New York City last year, there it essentially is the board of the redevelopment corporation, the Empire State Development Corporation in that case, that both is the sponsor of the plan and gets the vote on whether to approve it. And I think in that case, there's obviously not a meaningful chance that you're going to hear a different perspective from them when it's time for them to approve it than it was when it was time for them to sponsor it in the first place.
Let me make the conversation more difficult here, though, for a second. You guys can continue to argue with each other because it's helpful, but there's a fellow out here named Roger who has a really fascinating question.
Yeah.
And basically, what if the city or the redevelopment agency, in executing a policy of affordable housing, uses its eminent domain to keep a private landowner from flipping his subsidized project to a market rate-based one, right? Can you use eminent domain in that case, kind of cap a private enterprise profit? Any of the presenters want to comment?
I can just tell you, constitutionally after Kelo, that's the type of thing that is not going to be a problem any longer. I mean, as a constitutional matter, there's no prohibition against that use of eminent domain, and just, there are these sort of counterintuitive uses of eminent domain that you see happening. The most recent one is when, the typical story is the town gets captured by Walmart, Walmart comes in, gets eminent domain used in a neighborhood so they can build a new Walmart. Hercules, California just did the opposite. They wanted to stop Walmart from coming. Walmart had bought land in the town. They weren't abiding by the planning commission ordinances. They kept getting denied the permits to build. Walmart said, well, we'll just hold on to the land until we wait you out. The town turned around and said, no, you won't. We're going to take your land by eminent domain. We'll buy out Walmart, and then you're out of our town forever. So that's another kind of thing that Kelo makes possible. The harder question is, would any city be organized politically in a way in which they'd actually be likely to use eminent domain in a way that would actually be aimed at ensuring affordability over time rather than just ensuring higher property values?
And this is where, I'm not familiar with any case, Roger, where this has been done yet, but there are a lot of municipalities around the country that have reached in, at least to some extent, on exactly this question, expiring subsidies, and passed legislation that increases the burden on an owner looking to flip that property or opt out of the program, create greater notice requirements, create a right of first refusal for the existing tenants to buy it or the city to buy it, all of which to some extent presume this power. And some of us have been arguing exactly for this kind of thing, that obviously it's going to be buying the property at its market value, and as a way of preserving affordable housing is something that makes an enormous amount of sense. So I think it's a very good question.
Jim Cooney, you're throwing some things at us here. You ought to explain to people who can't speed write where those can be located when you're done with that.
Will do, Steve.
You want to do that now? Just tell people what you're doing up there, and we'll go back to the questions for another 15 or 20 minutes, then we'll break.
Sure. Where I am accessing our resources is on the Government Innovators Network page. If you go to www.innovations.harvard.edu and then to Expert Chat, I'm going to go back there. And then go to Expert Chats, and you'll see you can access this on KnowledgePlex and National City Network as well. We have a resources page. Click on that, and we have a variety of websites which have academic articles on eminent domain or professional articles, as well as a couple of recent newspaper articles. So we, of course, encourage audience members to look at that at their leisure after the event.
Okay, thanks. Let's continue with the audience questions. Maybe there's a question about Hercules up here and why cities in general, in this particular case, can't use code enforcement to kind of back into resolution. Why do they have to use eminent domain? Maybe they have they're sharper and less blunt tools. Any comments from panelists? Brad, have you summoned the city on some of your sites that you want to try to create a little pressure on? You don't have to concede anything for litigation purposes, but some general answer.
Well, I mean, I think it is, obviously, you saw in Melrose Commons a high percent of what the city had taken. It had taken for non-payment of taxes, and in some cases that actually also involved non-payment of fines that had been registered after people didn't keep their property up. So it's not impossible that there can be other situations where over long periods of time, if people really let their properties become run down, if you have meaningful code enforcement, that eventually those properties get taken by the city for code enforcement. And so I think that's another reasonable power the city's got to keep property up. I think if you're trying to assemble a particular site for a redevelopment plan, as we've discussed, it's not always going to be narrowly about questions of code enforcement. It's about a broader set of neighborhood conditions or achieving broader redevelopment goals with a redevelopment, and so not every property would be run down to that impact or not on the same timeline. So,
It's in the Walmart case.
Go ahead. Go.
In the Walmart case itself, just for this, the question was interested in that in particular. My understanding of what happened is they had a whole redevelopment plan for a shopping complex that was going to be right on the San Francisco Bay. And the problem was that the anchor store had been sold by the developer to Walmart. And the town had actually envisioned it was going to be all fancy little shops there. So it wasn't what they had in mind at all. It didn't get approved by the Planning Commission, but Walmart simply said, okay, well, we'll just build nothing. You'll have just a huge 17-acre hole in the middle of your fancy shopping center, and we'll just wait you out because, this is trivial money for us, whether we develop this particular property. And I think what they bet on was, we can wait you out for a long time, and eventually you'll come around and see that we're better than having just a hole in your redevelopment plan. And the town response was, well, we have other tools besides just denying you a permit. And if need be, we'll just take the property from you. They had tried to buy it, and Walmart had refused. So eminent domain actually is a useful backstop that goes in the way that Brad suggested in circumstances where code enforcement alone won't actually be enough to have the kind of development plan implemented the way that a town wants it to be.
Just to follow up on that, I think that you use code enforcement, you use nuisance law primarily on a parcel-by-parcel basis. And again, with eminent domain, what we're talking about is back to this redevelopment area, more of a broader, comprehensive approach to reinventing a community. And I'm going to try to go to one of my slides here. Jim, actually, it's actually the Indianapolis slide.
Good
maybe,
choice.
Steve, you know about the Fall River Place. project. What's interesting here is that, let me just give you a brief summary. You're looking at neighborhood 10 minutes from downtown Indianapolis, nicknamed God.
Is this going to be a good example or a bad example?
I think it's going to be a tremendous example.
Okay, good. I want to make sure what kind of record it is.
That you could always tell it was Bart Peterson's decision, right? That's, but again, it's a community originally known, Dodge City, a lot of drugs, violence, and what's interesting here is that private enterprise couldn't overcome the conditions of blight and deterioration. The city needed to step in and provide some assistance here. And what did they do? They designated this area as a redevelopment area. But what is striking is that it was the threat of eminent domain that led property owners to the table. It wasn't the actual exercise of it. So it gets back to one of the fundamental issues from a municipal standpoint, that eminent domain is a very, very powerful tool, and local elected officials that do not use it in a prudent manner are going to pay a political price, or they're going to lead to a high social and a high economic price.
Now that you've got my slide up there, let me make a couple quick comments. It seems to me that just listen to the last speaker just to highlight a few things. The racial disparities of condemnation in the massive, poorly planned urban renewal projects of a few decades ago clearly had a racial edge to them. But in the slides you have up here, the race issue actually turns on its head, and by that I mean most of these parcels that you found on this slide were grabbed up by slumlords, not neighborhood folks, in anticipation that the city may want to redevelop the area, and then they were essentially prohibiting comprehensive neighborhood redevelopment. So the race issues kind of turned on their heads. It seems to me where the issue becomes really complicated to me was I never had a nasty slumlord trying to hold out to extort the city. That was one thing, but the 70-year-old lady who lived in her house her entire life and intended to die there, even though that was a terrible economic decision on her part, whether I got to decide whether she had to move or she did, those were the issues that even in the blighted areas gave me the most difficulty. So all of these that you have on this slide were issues where I exercised my discretion wisely, even though I don't know where you found the slides. Let's do a couple more questions, and then we'll let Jim wrap up. I think what we hear from the panelists, there's a couple questions here, like the one that's highlighted from Julie about the effect of the Kelo case on nonprofit affordable housing. We basically listened to all of you. I don't see any realistic increase in restrictions other than the economic development legislation done by state legislators that's emanated from Kelo, or have I missed something here?
And by Congress.
Go ahead and explain that. Yeah,
so this is Brad. Congress last year, Senator Kip Bond from Missouri attached a rider to the Transportation, Treasury, and HUD bill that prohibits the use of federal funds for state and local projects that use eminent domain for economic development. That's a one-year rider, and there's actually a kind of study going along to see what to do about it. That doesn't come from Kelo. That's part of the congressional reaction to Kelo. And while it's not nearly as sort of prohibitive or restrictive as the Sensenbrenner bill that was proposed, it does represent some potential restrictions on the use of federal funds for eminent domain to a private owner that might include the development of affordable housing. So from my point of view, hopefully Congress won't choose to keep that in place next year. And I don't know any place yet around the country so far where an affordable housing development component of a project has been made infeasible as a result of this restriction, but there is some risk that could happen going forward.
Hey, Brad, this is David. Let me just back up on what you're saying here. The bond amendment, just to fill it out a little more, actually has a provision that says no federal money to state and locals that use eminent domain for an economic development project that primarily benefits a private entity. So we get back to the primary versus incidental argument, which is very good from what it was originally. second of all, it does have a request for the Government Accountability Office to examine what is the practice across the country on the use of eminent domain, which is actually quite useful given that Congress was throwing around a lot of solutions in search of a problem, it appeared last year. And there really is no definitive evidence that Congress needs to act here. The bad news, just to lay it out there, this bond amendment has been suggested for reauthorization this year. The House of Representatives late last week, passed the HUD Transportation Appropriations Bill, and it does include the bond amendment. And my guess, going back over to the Senate side, Mr. Bond is not inclined to take it out. So we probably see it for one more year. What does this mean for housing agencies and state investment entities? It means that it's important for them to work directly with their local field office of HUD to get clarification on what this means. There isn't going to be any official regulation on this issue, given that it's potentially a one-year lifespan ongoing, and it just makes it that much more incumbent for CDCs, housing authorities to work with HUD as well as Department of Transportation, because there's also transportation money at play here that people need to be aware of.
Mayor Goldsmith, there's one other actor here that I think is a potentially important actor and could impose some real limitations, and that's state courts interpreting the state constitution. So there was a famous decision in 1980 or 81 called the Poletown decision out of Michigan, which you may remember, in which Mayor Coleman Young, when the city was really up against the wall and GM was about to leave, took a large area, predominantly Polish area known as Poletown, and gave it to GM to build a GM plant. There was a huge controversy at the time. It went up to the state court, and there was a state constitutional challenge of the Michigan Constitution saying that you can't just take private property and give it to GM. That's not a public use under the state constitution. The Michigan Supreme Court said it was perfectly permissible use of eminent domain. Right before the Kelo decision, I think in 2005, the Michigan Supreme Court reversed itself, said that Poletown had been incorrectly decided, and put some real severe, at least substantial limitations on the use of eminent domain for economic development purposes, interpreting the Michigan Constitution. And other state courts may well follow suit. So the constitutional story at the federal level has sort of been decided by Kelo, but the constitutional issue as a matter of state Supreme Court decision-making, I think, is still very much open, and I would expect that the forces that lost in the Supreme Court of the United States will be pushing pretty hard in state courts across the country, particularly because the legislative response, though it's been substantial, hasn't really imposed the kind of limitations that a lot of those groups were looking for.
Yeah, David, this is Larry. I want to comment on David's point. He's very correct that state courts can play a significant role. One of the reasons some states did not pass legislation this year was because they already had pretty stringent state court opinions on the books, Washington State being one, strictly limiting the use of eminent domain. You look at the renovation in Seattle. We had our annual meeting in Seattle last year, and you would make an assumption that eminent domain must have been used for some of the economic development that took place there. It hadn't. We couldn't find a location where eminent domain had been used for economic development within the city of Seattle for some site visits that we were doing. And so I think the state courts will or can play a role. And in the legislation that's passed this year and last year, 6 states have proposed constitutional amendments on their ballots for this fall. So, depending on how those go, you will see, constitutional provisions and court interpretation of those, having the potential, impact on all of this.
In the last 5+ minutes, let's just run back through the presenters one at a time, starting with you, Brad, with it in kind of reverse order. I think there's a question here. It basically says, I'm in Ohio and, I've got to deal with these issues, the repercussions of the Kelo case. Let's just help articulate why Kelo touched a nerve, and if you were a local official in an area concerned about the repercussions of Kelo, how would you articulate the case for use of eminent domain? Let's, from your own perspective, start with Brad, and we'll kind of run in reverse order, and then we'll close.
Sure. I mean, look, you know, there's I think a well-founded fear in lots of different parts of the country, motivated and, you know, on both the right and the left of the potential for government overreach. That there's some risk that government does things that, you know, folks don't want in their neighborhoods. And I guess I would also say there's also in a lot of the stronger market cities right now real growth pressures as population is increasing, immigration is coming, and if we're going to manage the increasing growth and development over time, more development is going to take place. And I think people have a wide range of anxieties about it, and have, you know, that NIMBY has gone from being something about particular kinds of bad uses to a real anxiety about development more generally. And you put those two things together, the kind of fear of government overreach with anxiety about development, and you get this, you know, fueled by, you know, a fair amount of interest group money, you get a whole lot of reaction. That said, I think unless we can strengthen the public institutions that we have to plan for the communities we want to live in, what we see is a lot of evidence that the unbridled development of space by market developers, it doesn't do what we want either. It eats up open space in the suburbs and the exurbs. It doesn't give us the public transportation infrastructure or the mixed income communities, and it leaves a lot of areas of blight where the market chooses not to go at all. And that what we need are stronger institutions that can really do community planning, that then have this municipal power, and that this is a way that we can get the kind of mixed income, mixed use communities that have some smart growth features, that have public transportation, good open space, and are balanced. It's not easy, and it takes a kind of a public process and a public debate, but that's what we should have, and we want our processes that help us try to get there, and that do require a strong case to be made for why this particular kind of development is something that will help make the city or the neighborhood a stronger place rather than a weaker one.
Thank you. David Parkhurst.
I'll be brief. I agree. I think that the anxiety that people feel about eminent domain, it's a real anxiety, and nobody wants their home taken. There's no doubt about that. However, I would argue that in the last year, more homes were taken by natural disasters than they were by the power of eminent domain. So I think we need to keep things in perspective here. What's the good that comes out of Kelo? I think that the good is very exciting. It's an opportunity to take a heretofore relatively obscure, except for city attorneys and local development officials, tool, eminent domain, chance to dust off the code books, review it in light of changes in our communities and our regions, and make things better. I think the opportunity to improve the process is critical, and I think that when you look back at the case record here, and when you look at what organizations like AARP and NAACP really said in their amicus briefs, it was focused on process. It's let the people who are most affected by this very awesome tool have a real legitimate shot at being at the table to ensure that their interests are protected and that the greater community good is served. So there are some very good things that can come out if we let it come out and hold off on the fiery rhetoric.
Do you, I'm going to call on Larry next, but do you or Brad or maybe any of the panelists, have you tried to inventory? I have this highlighted question here about banks being reluctant to lend on eminent domain projects. Was it Wachovia? One of the banks took a "we won't lend" attitude. Has anybody run into that at a broad scale, or is that just kind of a one-off?
I think it's just a one-shot deal. In fact, it was BB&T Bank down.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I apologize. It wasn't
I think that was more of a policy decision by the senior bank execs there that didn't really get a whole lot of media shelf life. In fact, in speaking with other large lenders, nobody would go on the record in support of what BB&T said. Well, it raised an interesting point, and for the listeners, Fitch Ratings Service issued a report several months ago that takes the long ball look at the issue here. And in fact, I think if you can jump to my last slide here. I think I've got a brief summary of it. Things to look to in the long term here. That the potential for municipalities and states that restrict the use of eminent domain is in the long term the potential downgraded credit quality, obviously diminished curb appeal of a community, and again, when we're competing, Indianapolis is competing with Chicago and Detroit and Kansas City and quite honestly Taipei and the like, that's an issue. Disadvantage of cities both here and abroad, and more importantly, the increased cost to government. Because if you've got a community that can't take care of itself economically, it's not going to be an attractive place for communities in the long term. So credit quality is a real legitimate issue, but one that is long term.
Very good. Thanks so much. Larry?
Yeah, just a couple closing comments. If you could go back to my slides to that map. And if you look at that map, and everything that's colored is either statute, constitutional amendment, both, or where legislation is passed and vetoed. On its face, it looks like almost the presidential election returns of 2 years ago, red state, blue state, in terms of where states have passed laws and where they haven't. But I want to emphasize the bipartisan nature of the legislative response that we've seen. A state like Michigan, which in a national election is a blue state, but whose both houses are controlled by Republicans, but they have a blue governor, you know, that type of thing, very bipartisan. And their legislation, a constitutional amendment that'll be on the ballot in November, passed unanimously in the House. So I want to emphasize that this is not a partisan issue. It's not a Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal type issue. The other thing I want to say is, even though we've seen 2/3 of the states pass some type of restrictions, as David Barron has pointed out, they're all over the board. And even the ones that prohibit the use of eminent domain for economic development, very few of them define what economic development is. And so there will still be these opportunities for legislatures and local governments to get together and kind of get a sense as to what is and is not permissible. But I would point out to the mayor that one of the more restrictive bills, in my opinion, is the legislation that Indiana passed this year. So I'd be interested in, at some point in your comments, is based upon your tenure there and what you were able to accomplish, whether the provisions in House Bill 1010, which you can download from our website, really put that much of an impact on the ability of the city of Indianapolis to use eminent domain. And my last comment is I don't think we'll really know how significant this legislation passed in these 31 states is until somebody looks on a state-by-state basis as to how eminent domain has been used, because a lot of this language appears very sweeping. But if, in fact, eminent domain had not been used to that threshold level in the past, can you suggest that this is putting restrictions on its use? So I think, we're only 1 year out. Obviously, that research hasn't been done nationally on a comparative basis, but it's not until we find that out will we really know whether a lot of this language is raising the bar, but to a level that maybe not many people would have gotten to in the first place. So.
Okay, great. Professor Barron, you, as any good lawyer, you get to open and close, and tell the listeners in Ohio why they should say to their local legislators and state legislators that Kelo is much ado about nothing. I exaggerate.
Yeah, I don't think that would be my first sentence to them. I don't know how it would be, but I think that, I think people have a split views on property, and they always have. On the one hand, we think my home is a castle, and on the other hand, we recognize that no person is an island, and you live in a community. The reason we have a zoning power is because as much as you think no one should tell you what to do with your property, you think it's very important that you be able to tell other people what they can do with their property. And people understand that their own value in their property depends on the community's success. And that balance is a real balance, but I think it's just foolish to pretend there's not a balance to be made here. And the story you tell, Mayor, is I think a real one of the 70-year-old woman who's going to be forced out of a house, and it's not an attractive thing to do. On the other hand, when you have a community that's in real distress, and you finally have a credible redevelopment plan in place, and you have the actors in place and the community engaged with it, the prospect of a single person's idiosyncratic views, understandable views, desire to remain where they live, prohibiting the community as a whole from moving forward and stopping its decline, is something that the Constitution and the founders early on understood might come up. And the way we tend to resolve that, whether it's a new road coming through, a railroad coming through, or now a redevelopment project, is we provide compensation for that person, often quite substantial compensation, sometimes at a premium above what the market would be for it. And we do that so that the larger number of people who live in the community will get the benefits that they need, and that as a society we decided we're better off doing it that way, painful as that choice is. But that is the real choice, and I think just pretending that there's not a choice to be made, that we can just protect the sanctity of private property, each person's home is a castle and everyone will be fine, isn't our history, and it's not likely to be what the future will show to have been the correct decision.
Thanks, great conversation, and your summary is helpful because it reminds us that government daily impinges on property rights in some ways, whether it's zoning or wetlands mitigation, or you can't dump obnoxious stuff out of your smokestack, or whatever the case may be. So it's a great conversation with some talented panelists and great questions. Jim, why don't you close it up by telling folks where they can see the archive and your resource page one more time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mayor Goldsmith. So once again, I'm just going to display the URLs for the 3 sponsors of this event. You can access this recording on the Government Innovators Network, the National City Network, or KnowledgePlex, and those are the URLs displayed up there. And on those, I'm just going to show you the resources page one more time. So this format is similar on KnowledgePlex and National City Network, and you'll simply go to the toolbar on the left and click Expert Chat, and you should see today's chat, the eminent domain 1 year after Kelo. And there you can also find, that's where you'll find the archive, and you can also find the related resources page.
There's a question there. Jim, there's a question there about where can one of the listeners find copies of each state's statutes, and I assume that's on the NCSL page, perhaps?
Well, we have, this is Larry, on our webpage, we have 2 legislative sites, one for 2005 legislation, like I said, in the 5 states that passed it right after Kelo, and then one bullet for 2006. Click on either one of those 2, and you'll see brief summaries that we prepared here at the staff level, and then a link directly either to the bill itself or to the legislature's search engine to get the bill. Some of the legislative websites, you can't access the bill directly from another site. You've got to go into their search engine. But you will be able to at least pull down where you can find the bill in its latest version from NCSL's website.
All right. Thanks to everybody for just a terrific conversation, and I hope you find our resources helpful. Thanks to the presenters, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.